A meeting with Anthony Albanese next week might be the last thing on Donald Trump's mind right now, given the spectacular blow-up of his bromance with Elon Musk. But the Australian Prime Minister is already focused on his first face-to-face with the President. And he's preparing the ground for where he's willing to move and where he won't budge on trade and defence. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Historically, meeting a US president has been a highlight for Australian Prime Ministers, but a sit-down with Donald Trump can also be high risk. It's not locked in yet, but Anthony Albanese is already laying down markers for a meeting expected to be held at the G7 in just over a week. Beef and critical minerals are on the table. While the Prime Minister wants a friendly relationship, he doesn't want to give ground to a president many Australians dislike on issues important to the national interest. He wants tariffs dropped without ceding to Trump's demands, and he doesn't want to be told by the US what to do on defence spending.
A major escalation in President Trump's trade war.
He intends to double US steel import tariffs to 50%.
Nobody's going to get around that.
The UK's been spared from the doubling of steel and aluminium tariffs.
Did you ask, Minister, for the same deal as the UK has?
I've asked for the removal of all tariffs.
The Prime Minister could be about to put beef on the table in crunched trade negotiations with Donald Trump.
They ban American beef.
If things can be sorted out in a way that protects our biosecurity, of course.
Obviously, we're deeply concerned.
We don't just say no. We don't want imports in here for the sake of it.
Using our beef industry as a pawn in some sort of trade deal.
Australia wants the Americans to adopt a system that can track cattle from birth to slaughter to keep diseases out.
We haven't been assured there's a system that allows for appropriate tracing of animals.
This will decimate the agricultural sector if we blink and allow President Trump to be able to roll over us.
Our first priority is biosecurity, and there'll be no compromise on that.
It's a partnership as strong and robust as it's ever been, and is important.
The United States has asked Australia to lift its defence spending to 3.5% of GDP.
We'll determine our defence policy.
The Prime Minister is resisting pressure from our closest ally.
What you should do in defence is decide what you need, your capability, and then provide for it.
We may need to operate and conduct combat operations from this country.
Rising strategic tensions, China's massive military build-up, the war in Ukraine are all fueling a global arms race.
We need to spend more money on defence.
It's not about spending just more, it's about spending smarter.
We will need to increase our defence spending going forward.
Get pushed and pulled in both directions when it comes to defence spending.
We should increase defence spending in Australia, but not because an American tells us to, but because it's in our national interest.
We understand the American view, and America understands that we will determine our defence spending.
Anthony Albanese will soon be holding his first meeting with Donald Trump.
When they meet at the G7...
Are you at all nervous? I'm the Prime Minister of Australia. We don't have a subservient relationship to any nation.
And my guest this morning is the Shadow Finance Minister James Paterson. First, let's check what's making news. 1 in 10 children between the ages of 5 and 7 are now using the NDIS, according to the 9 newspapers, as federal and state governments remain caught up in negotiations over funding a new system of alternative supports. The so-called foundational supports won't be starting in July, as had been planned. 15% of 6-year-old boys are now on the NDIS. And the US and China are set to hold high-level talks on Monday, aimed at bringing their trade war to an end. High-level officials, including the US Treasury Secretary and China's Vice Premier, will meet in London. Donald Trump and Xi Jinping spoke for 2 hours on the phone earlier. President Trump says China has agreed to restart the flow of critical minerals.
We had a very good talk. It's a complicated deal, but it's a deal that's, that
bring us a lot of money and a lot of everything else.
Well, the Prime Minister will address the Press Club on Tuesday to lay out his second-term agenda. He'll talk about delivering election promises, and he'll temper expectations that he's about to use Labor's huge majority to go beyond the mandate it won. Anthony Albanese is taking a similarly cautious approach towards his first face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump. He's not bending over backwards for a trade deal at any cost. He'll state Australia's case, repeat its offer of access to critical minerals, but won't give ground on Trump's demands. Let's bring in the panel, see what they think of it. We're joined by Karen Middleton, James Massola and Jane Norman. Very good morning to all of you. Look, I want to start with trade and cheekily, Karen, get a bit of an insight on what's going on with Elon Musk and Donald Trump, because trade is part of this extraordinary, inevitable, but still incredible blow-up between the most powerful man and the world's richest man. Elon Musk is saying these tariffs will tip the US into recession. Do you think this is going to make Trump any more or less likely to give ground on the tariffs?
You're asking me to read Donald Trump's mind. If I could do that, I'd go set up in Washington. No, yeah. Look, I think if we were on an episode of Yes Minister, that old British show, we would say that it's unhelpful to be caught up in a domestic spat like this. What did Elon Musk call Pete Navarro, the trade representative, as dumb as a box of rocks?
Dumb as a box of rocks.
You know, I just think when we're trying to make an argument to Donald Trump and his administration about lowering tariffs, having someone like Elon Musk on the sideline suggesting that they should dump them might just make them more inclined to hang on to them, and that's not necessarily a great thing for us.
No, but for Anthony Albanese, James, I mean, his message will be, we've heard it consistently, that this is economic self-harm for America to be applying these tariffs. What approach will the Australian Prime Minister take, do you think, towards this meeting, which you point out, still not locked in? Trump, very unpredictable, as noted. Who knows whether he'll even turn up, but it's expected he will, and there will be a meeting. Yeah, look, we are expecting it's more likely the meeting between the two of them happen in Canada rather than the US when the PM's there. Look, I think what we're going to see is a more confident Anthony Albanese, David, who has just had obviously a resounding tick from the Australian people. I don't think he's going to be in any mood to give up or give in too easily to Donald Trump on anything. He'll state the case, as you yourself touched on. This is why Australia should be exempt. There's obviously possibilities of deals on beef or on critical minerals. There's a number of sort of carrots the PM can use to appeal to Donald Trump. But I think at the end of the day, he's not, for example, going to compromise. He's made that very clear on the biosecurity laws. So, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I won't prognosticate on that. Let's talk about those biosecurity laws that Australia has had in place. We haven't bought American beef for 20 years. This is one of the main beefs of Donald Trump, no doubt about it. And I know, Jane, you've been digging into this as well. We heard from the Prime Minister on Friday a commitment not to water down those biosecurity laws.
Well, we'll never loosen any rules regarding our biosecurity. If things can be sorted out in a way that protects our biosecurity, of course, we don't just say no.
And what does that mean, Jane, if things can be sorted out? What's he talking about?
He's talking about a review that's underway right now by the Australian government into a request by the United States to basically expand market access for their beef producers. So Donald Trump asserts that we ban American beef, and we do not ban American beef. Since 2019, we have allowed beef from America, provided the cattle is born, raised and slaughtered in the US. And that's tricky for American beef producers because they have a big integrated system across the Northern American continent. So they want Australia to also permit cattle that's come from Mexico and Canada that's slaughtered in America. That's been the subject of a review within industry. There is an expectation that the review is basically finalised, that the report has been imminent for months. And so I think if you're reading between the lines, you might come to the conclusion that this review has made a favourable conclusion towards the US request. And an issue, as you mentioned in your introduction, is traceability. In Australia, every animal, cattle are tagged electronically at birth. And so by the time they're slaughtered, we know exactly which farm they've been on, which feedlot they've been fed in, and which abattoir they end up in.
The Americans can't or don't?
They don't at the moment have that level of traceability, particularly for the Mexican and Canadian side.
So you could have a Mexican cow, and there's a concern it could even come from a another country.
And that's mainly it. It's
through
the
Mexico
leakage.
and then slaughtered in the abattoir in the US, and that's what they want to know about.
That's exactly it. And so if the Americans can satisfy the demand around traceability, that is the key demand, then you can see a world in which Australia does basically accept the US request. And of course, the whole idea of this is to keep diseases out. We're an island nation. We want to keep foot and mouth disease, foot and mouth, lumpy skin, mad cow disease out of Australia. And so that's why biosecurity laws are never traded, I'm told, as part of any kind of negotiation with the government.
Look, just on the traceability issue, David Littleproud, the Nationals leader, was making a similar point about what the Americans need to do.
The United States should be able to prove the same as Australian farmers can trace their beast from when they're born right through to slaughter. The United States should be able to do that through their supply chains, not just through the United States, but back through the other parts of their supply chains in Mexico and Canada.
Tell you what's interesting, I mean, maybe there's some ground there and possible breakthrough on that front, but even with the tariff that Trump's put in place, our beef exports globally have shot up. They're at record highs over the last year, and our beef exports to China are up 41%.
Chinese have been making a big thing of this on social media and elsewhere. You know, oh, we're loving Australian beef. We prefer Australian beef.
Yep,
you know,
better quality, all of those things.
Reflecting on where we were a few years ago, that's quite interesting.
Is this an example of the US-China trade war having some benefit for Australian exporters, because we can sell more to China?
Well, it can go either way. So in this case, we can sell more to China, but there's also a concern that if other countries, other commodities get blocked from the US, they will look for markets and maybe steal our markets in selling their goods. So there's an upside and a downside.
And if the Chinese economy is weakened, then we're weakened as well. So it swings and roundabouts.
But our beef exports to the United States have also increased. So MLA figures released on Thursday showed that year on year, exports are up 32%, and that's because the US...
Even with the tariffs.
Even with the tariffs. And so I think that this also kind of underscores the whole approach towards our desire to get these tariffs removed. Like, everybody wants the 10% blanket tariff gone, the 50% steel and aluminium tariff gone. But because our exports to the United States are only worth sort of 4% of our total exports, there just isn't the kind of economic and political imperative or pressure that other nations have.
It's a really good point, James. This goes to the attitude, the approach the Prime Minister is likely to take in the meeting. It's going to be, well, you know, we're not about to, because we're actually doing okay, we're not about to move on things like the pharmaceutical benefit scheme or the way we treat American big tech companies in Australia.
Yeah, big tech's another great example, actually. Australia is one of a number of countries that the US is unhappy with for imposing these, beginning to start imposing requirements about, validation of age and...
media bargaining.
Yeah, precisely.
Media companies.
And the American view is that essentially that's a clamp or a reduction in Americans' freedom to be able to speak freely, rather, I should say. And that they hate these rules. But I can't see Anthony Albanese giving any ground on that. And we know from published polling, it's hugely popular as well. Like, there's few parents who disagree with, stopping kids, keeping them off till they're 16. Right?
Yeah, and that's where his domestic political interests kick in, right? Because it's not going to undermine the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Imagine if anything happens that starts to dismantle that, what the attitude of Australians would be. And equally, he has staked an awful lot on things like the minimum social media usage and all of those things politically. So I agree, I can't see him doing it.
Standing firm against Donald Trump generally. Didn't hurt him in the election.
No, and Mark Carney as well. And the staggering figure in all of this discussion, all this discussion about the beef, 6 billion hamburgers, Australian hamburgers, is how many Americans buy each, or how much Americans consume of our meat every year. That's 18 burgers per American. It's a staggering figure.
Well, you're our biggest customer for beef, high stakes.
All right, we'll come back to the defence spending part of the meeting as well shortly, but time to talk to the Shadow Finance Minister James Paterson now. To take us there, he was the Prime Minister, on how Australia, in his view, has been treated by the US on trade.
It's that across the board, these tariffs have been imposed, including on Australia, and we think because of a range of issues, our free trade agreement, the fact the US has a trade surplus to Australia, this is an act of economic self-harm, and we'll continue to advocate for Australia's interests.
James Paterson, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David.
So before the election, Peter Dutton was, of course, suggesting he could convince Donald Trump to drop the tariffs entirely on Australia. Do you now have a more realistic expectation of what can and should be achieved by the Prime Minister when he does sit down with the President?
Well, David, we don't control the decisions of the Trump administration in the United States, but what we expect of the Prime Minister, including if he does meet with him next week on the sidelines of the G7, is to put our best case forward, because the workers and the families of people in industries who are affected, particularly something like steel and aluminium, deserve nothing less than that. And I do recall when it was suggested during the election campaign that exemptions could be achieved, that was generally dismissed and downplayed. But of course, Keir Starmer has now achieved a partial exemption from the steel and aluminium tariffs, and Australia is at least as good an ally of the United States as the United Kingdom is, and so there's no reason why the Prime Minister shouldn't at least be able to secure that exemption.
So on that, the UK has done a deal with Donald Trump, and that involves granting unprecedented access for American beef to the British market. Are you saying Australia should do that?
No, I'm not saying that, David. We should not compromise in any way, shape or form on biosecurity, and those issues of traceability that Jane Norman outlined, I think framed the issue very well from our point of view as well. We have no in-principle objection to American beef being exported to Australia, but it must meet our high biosecurity standards, and we will be holding the Prime Minister to his commitment that he will not compromise on that in any way, shape or form.
Okay, but you're essentially saying he should get the deal that Keir Starmer has got without doing what Keir Starmer has done to get it.
No, I'm not saying that, David. I'm just saying that Keir Starmer proves that it is possible to get an exemption. It is not an impossible task, and what we ask and expect of the Prime Minister is that he put our best foot forward, that he make those arguments. And I have to say, I think that would have been much easier if, like Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister had made the effort to go and meet the President earlier than he has now. It's 7 months on since the President was elected, and other world leaders like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron have made the trip to the United States and have met with the President multiple times in multiple forums. The Australian Prime Minister has not yet done so.
On critical minerals, because clearly this seems to be the big offering from Australia for Donald Trump. Where does the coalition now stand on this? Because it was a little confusing before the election. Do you support the Australian government setting up a stockpile of critical minerals and offering access to the US to that stockpile?
Well, we haven't been briefed, David, on what the government's intentions in this area are, and there's only been media speculation about that. They've not publicly outlined exactly what they have in mind. But any sensible steps that represent an economic opportunity for Australia and an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we are a good alliance partner of the United States is something that we would offer bipartisan support to. Now, there's been some informed reporting, I suspect, by Phil Curry and others in the AFR over the weekend that talked about off-take agreements and stockpiling and other issues. We're open for a conversation about that, and we're open to providing bipartisan support, subject to the details.
Okay, because prior to the election, the coalition, I think, was opposed to a stockpile. You're now open to it.
Well, of course, we're open to any sensible steps in the national interest that takes advantage of the extraordinary opportunities that are present in the critical industry market. This is a market which is dominated by China. Strategically, they've gone out and sought to dominate it. We have many of those critical minerals here in Australia. Processing them is not something that's straightforward or easy to do, but it is something that Australia could do, which would represent an economic opportunity and a strategic contribution.
Yeah, with government resources to do that, government supporting the mining and processing of critical minerals. This is a threshold question. You're now open to that.
That might be necessary, David, and we're very happy to see what the government is proposing here. I can't commit to it in principle without having seen the details, but we're certainly open to it because we think critical minerals is an opportunity for Australia.
On defence spending, the Trump administration wants Australia to go to 3.5% of GDP in terms of defence spending. Can you just clear up what the coalition's position now is on this? Is this something that's going to be subject to your policy review, or are you still committed to what you took to the election, which was to increase to 3% of GDP defence spending within a decade?
Well, about 5 weeks ago, David, we told Australians that it was critical for our national security that we get to 3% of GDP defence spending. And in the last 5 weeks, I don't know about you, but I don't think the world has become a much safer place. So we are committed to reaching that 3% of GDP target. Of course, the exact profiling of that increase is something that we'll determine through our policy process, and closer to the next election, we'll be completely upfront and transparent about that. But yes, we have an objective of reaching to 3% of GDP because we think it's in our national interest.
One of the criticisms at the time was that you made this commitment without saying what it was for, what sort of kit you wanted to buy with this extra well, I think it'd be an extra $30 billion a year or thereabouts. Is this the same issue now, though? You're still committing to this spending target without saying why or what we need it for?
Well, we've got 3 years to outline exactly what we could spend that money on, but there's plenty of good advice out there in open source that suggests some good areas for investment. One is spending to resolve the recruitment and retention crisis facing the ADF. Another is to make sure we have the munitions stockpile we would need to survive a conflict, God forbid, if that should break out. Other things like hardening our northern bases, like air and missile defence, drone defence, purchasing our own lethal drones. There is no shortage of good things we could spend on that would increase our ability to defend ourselves and safeguard our sovereignty. And many of Australia's best informed national security experts advocate that we do so. There's no two private citizens better informed about the risk we face than Professor Peter Dean and Sir Angus Houston, because they completed the Defence Strategic Review for the Albanese government, and they have both since said that we should be spending at least 3% of GDP. Now, I think it's reckless in the extreme to ignore advice like that, particularly when your own government has commissioned it.
And neither of them suggested we needed extra joint strike fighters. And I noticed in the list you just gave us, you didn't mention them either. Is that now dropped as a coalition policy?
Well, the Albanese government has cancelled a lot of defence capability that would have arrived over the next few years before the AUKUS submarines arrive. Included in that is a 4th squadron of joint strike fighters, but also infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled howitzers, the military satellite communications technology referred to as JP2-9102. I mean, these are really important capabilities that have been cancelled. Now, the world is going to move on over the next 3 years by the time the next election approaches. I'm not going to commit on your show now to which capabilities we should acquire, but I'm confident there'll be many good things we could invest in which would make our country safer.
You know your stuff on defence by the sounds of it there, James Paterson, but you are the finance portfolio holder now as Shadow Finance Minister. Let me turn to that. Because if you are going to commit, as you have, to this 3% target, that's a big uplift, as I say, around $30 billion extra a year. You'll be responsible for trying to make the numbers add up. Can you at least give us a sense of your approach here, your preferred approach here to finding money? Is it through higher taxes or is it through spending cuts?
David, you're right. It's unusual to have a Shadow Minister for Finance enthusiastically advocating for an increase in spending in any portfolio, but that's the advice of our experts and that is the environment we find ourselves in, and so I'm very comfortable doing so. And we will do the hard work over the next 2.5 years or so to put in place some good, strong fiscal rules that allow us to take to the next election a strong budget that invests in the things that Australians need, including the critical services they rely on domestically, but also our national security and defence. Forgive me if I'm not going to outline the details of that 10 days into this new job.
No, I appreciate that. It was more about the preferred, the principle.
It
was more about the principle. I appreciate you're going to take your time to work on exactly how you do it. But what's the principle here? Your Deputy Leader and Shadow Treasurer Ted O'Brien has been saying that you're against Australians having to cop higher taxes. So should we interpret that as no higher taxes under the coalition to pay for the various things you want to pay for?
It's certainly in the Liberal Party's DNA, David, to argue for and advocate for lower taxes whenever they can be afforded and whenever they are achievable. And that's what you'll see under Susan Lee's leadership and also under the Shadow Treasurer Ted O'Brien and me as Shadow Finance Minister. Because frankly, as I've said recently, David, I think we made a strategic mistake at the last election by opposing a tax cut and taking to the election repealing of that tax cut, and that's not a mistake that we'll repeat.
So then it brings us to superannuation. Are you open to any change on the way superannuation is taxed in Australia?
If the Albanese government and the Treasurer Jim Chalmers were talking about genuine tax reform, holistic tax reform across the board that, for example, reduce the collection of taxes in inefficient areas and collected that revenue in less distortionary ways, we'd be up for that conversation. We'd be happy to sit down and have that. But that's not what this is. This is a grab for revenue from people's family savings in a way that will have severe unintended consequences at a time in which the Australian economy desperately needs more investment. Jim Chalmers is proposing effectively a tax on investment, and we think that is both wrong in principle and the wrong decision for Australia right now.
So this is interesting. You would be open to some other sort of superannuation tax increase on higher income earners if it meant we could trade that off with lower taxes for income tax for working Australians or company tax if it's part of a bigger tax reform?
Well, you've overcooked that slightly, David. That wasn't what I was saying. We are opposed to higher taxes. We do not think we need higher taxes. But I think a lot of experts recognise that the way we collect revenue in this country is not as efficient as it could be. There have been numerous reviews into the inefficiencies of the Australian tax system. And if the government was genuinely serious about a broad-based tax reform process, then we'd be up for that conversation. Now, the government has to take the first steps there. They just won the election. They have a big majority. They have a majority in the Senate with their Greens coalition partners, and they have all the resource of government. But if they're genuine about that, of course we would sit down with them. But of course, we would have our own principles in that. We're not going to be party to raising taxes. We're not going to be party to making it easier for a Labor government to increase taxes. That's not in the DNA of the Liberal Party.
But isn't that tax reform? You're going to have to put something up to cut somewhere else.
We're happy to contemplate tax reform, David. We're happy to talk to the government about tax reform, but we are not interested in increasing taxes because I don't think that's what the Australian economy needs right now. Business investment is at decade lows. Productivity is declining. Per capita GDP is declining. I mean, we have an economy right now on life support, and Jim Chalmers has no plans and no ideas to get us out of that. And I'm very worried about what that means for the future of our children and grandchildren.
Okay, but just on the super tax that he is putting before the Parliament, obviously you have a problem with the unrealised gains being taxed and the failure to index this tax. But in saying you're not going to engage in any negotiation with the government, aren't you leaving this to the Greens to do a deal with Labor?
Well, the truth is, David, because of the extent of the government's win at the election, if they don't want to sit down and negotiate with us, they have other pathways available to them that they didn't have in the last
And is
Parliament.
that responsible?
In fact, even if the entire crossbench and the coalition opposes it, they can still pass things with the Greens. Now, the Greens are a more natural ally for the government on something like a tax increase because we are never going to be party to a tax increase. We're never going to make that easier for the government. And we're fighting this because we're opposed to it in principle and we're proud to do so.
All right, so if you're opposed to tax increases, any tax increases, but you've still got to find tens of $billions a year for defence spending and anything else you want to do, that brings us to where you're going to cut. And again, I don't want to get too far ahead of the process that you've got to go through, but I know you've made some comments about the public service job cuts that you did take to the election. You've said some of the language used around that was unfortunate. Was the policy itself also unfortunate?
Well, like all of our other election policies, that policy is up for review and we're making no specific commitments about what we'll do at the next election because between now and then there'll probably be 3 budgets, there'll probably be 3 MAFOs. We'll have a lot of assessment of where we are financially to be made. But I'm being quite candid about this. I think we got the tone of that conversation wrong. We want a productive and respectful relationship with the Australian Public Service. I have seen in my previous committee roles, particularly on the Intelligence Committee, how professional and patriotic and dedicated our public servants are. They deserve to be respected for the role they do. We of course expect them to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, and the Liberal Party will always want to spend that money as efficiently as possible, but we want to do so in a way that's constructive.
Okay, so the tone was wrong, but you might still go back to public service cuts. It's under review.
Well, all of our policies are under review, David, and I can't commit now what our policy is going to be in 2.5 years' time. It'll depend on the choices that the Albanese government makes between now and then and the state of the economy. Right now, we're headed for a decade of deficits and $1.2 trillion of debt, and it doesn't seem like Jim Chalmers has any plans to close that gap.
Just finally, the final recount in the seat of Bradfield confirms the Liberal Party lost the seat to Community Independent Nicolette Buller. There are only 26 votes in it, though. Any decision yet on whether the Liberal Party will challenge this in the Court of Disputed Returns?
Not to my knowledge, David. I understand the New South Wales Liberal Party is reviewing our legal options, and I really hope that we can find a way to have Giselle Capterian in the Parliament in this term, because she's exactly the kind of person that would make the Liberal Party better, the Parliament better, and our country better. She's got great insights, great professional experience. She's a person I hope to be playing a big role in the future of our party, but it'll be up to the New South Wales Division, and then ultimately, if we do decide to make any application, the Court of Disputed Returns to decide that.
And if they did, the only way forward would be a by-election. Giselle Capterian, your Liberal candidate you referenced there, such a good candidate, as you say. She says the position on net zero has been put to bed by the Liberal Party. Has it been put to bed?
I'm not sure you're right about a by-election there, David. On that issue in the past, for example, in the seat of McEwen, there was an appeal to the Court of Disputed Returns that changed the decision of the AEC count, so it's not necessarily the case. On something like net zero, as I've said before, David, as Susan has said, all of our policies are up for review. Yes, emissions reduction is important to us and will be an important feature of our policy. We have a shadow minister for emissions reduction and energy in my colleague Dan Tehan, but so is affordability and reliability, and we'll get that balance right.
I guess the point is, if the court did say there's got to be a by-election in Bradfield, could the Liberal Party really fight a by-election in a seat like Bradfield without a position on net zero?
Look, I'm not going to publicly engage in a debate about an internal policy issue like that. I've got the opportunity to do so through the shadow cabinet process. But if there is a by-election, I would back Giselle Kapterian because she's an outstanding candidate, an outstanding Liberal, and someone who's placed to make a very big contribution to the future of our country inside one of the major parties that will ultimately form government in this country. That's not something that an independent can do. And if the independents were relatively inconsequential in the last parliament, they're going to be even less relevant in this one.
Senator James Paterson, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, David.
All right, well, coming up, we're going to turn to tax. The comments there opening the door, perhaps, to bigger tax reform in this term of Parliament and also this current debate over superannuation tax. I want to come back to the panel, though, Karen Middleton, James Massola and Jane Norman, just on defence spending, because the commitment there is very clear, Karen, from the Shadow Finance Minister. They're remaining with this 3% target.
Yep.
You know, how they get there and what the money's spent on is TBC, but that is an important early commitment or recommitment from the coalition.
Yeah, there was some indication in a piece that Angus Taylor wrote a week or so ago in The Australian about what they thought the priorities should be. I think he talked about things like drones, guided missiles and cyber and undersea technologies.
Not joint strike fighters?
He hasn't named those, no. But look, I think the other interesting thing that maybe has been slightly overlooked in the debate about the Pete Hegseth meeting with Richard Marles and the whole 3.5% request is that the readout that the Pentagon published after that had some other interesting detail in it, and it suggested that they had also discussed, and I quote, accelerating US force posture initiatives in Australia. Well, that means hurrying up, putting more American stuff here. What exactly?
Well,
so I think we don't know what the Americans are actually asking.
No, and this is what I found interesting as well, because the CDF, the Chief of Defence in Australia, Admiral David Johnston, and I'll show you what he said on spending in a moment, but he also said this week, we need to think, perhaps the first time since World War II, about our homeland, Australian soil being used to launch combat operations from. Now, it's hard to think we would be doing that in any sort of scenario, be it in the South China Sea, Taiwan or closer to here, without the Americans, right?
Well, that is a logical conclusion. The Defence Strategic Review of a few years ago does talk about that kind of thing. It says we need capability to be able to fire from Australia and keep any adversary at bay from here, further at bay, and to then be able to move out and also meet adversaries where they are. But it's really interesting that the CDF is highlighting that in the current context when we're talking about whether we need to increase defence spending and on what.
Yeah, well, let's look at whether we need to increase defence spending. As you say, Karen, the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth meets Marles in Singapore, says you guys have got to lift to 3.5% of GDP. Big leap from we're currently at 2%, getting up to 2.3%. Richard Marles comes out of that meeting, and I want to show you, his initial tone was, yeah, we're right up for this conversation. And then by the end of the week, it was a somewhat different tone.
As I've repeatedly said, that's a conversation we are totally up for in terms of the way in which we engage with the United States. We will determine our defence spending based on our own strategic interest, and we've made that very clear.
And the Prime Minister's been making that clear, hasn't he, too? This is a sovereign matter for Australia. We'll decide what we spend on defence in the circumstances in which we spend it, James.
Yep, exactly. He is pushing into that famous John Howard phrase, or borrowing, if you like. Anthony Albanese's view, David, is that you don't set a target in any other portfolio, say health, and say, right, we must spend 4% on health. Yeah. Don't know what we're going to spend it on, whether it's the hospital or the x-ray machine or the doctor or the whatever, but we have to spend it. You'd be laughed out of expenditure review committee if you said that. So his view is essentially, well, why would defence be treated any differently? And I think that's a reasonable point. The counter is, it's about ambition. If you say we're going to hit 3%, than people working in over the up the road at Russell in Defence HQ.
But allies as well.
That way.
Allies as well get a sense of how serious you are.
Exactly. So that you do send an important message by committing to that, but you've got to get the right kit. You've got to get kit that we actually need. Do we actually need infantry fighting vehicles? You mentioned them a moment ago, which were cancelled. How much utility will they be on the actual continent of Australia? Not probably potentially that much, hopefully.
Where political leaders can agree is there's too much waste in defence.
Yeah.
The cost overruns, the waste, the inefficiency in all of these projects is legendary. So Defence does need to spend smarter and more effectively and not be wasting so much money. They're going to come asking for more.
Yeah, and there's also been this notorious underspend each year for years in defence, but I'll show you what the Chief of Defence said on this, because this was significant as well. He now says they're basically spending every penny.
Defence is fully expending its budget at the moment. That's a good thing. As we've uplifted our acquisition delivery, workforce is improving, our view of what we need to do around readiness. That does put pressure on a budget that we have to make choices on.
Pressure on the budget. We have to make choices. Not very subtle pitch there, is it, Jane?
Not at all. He's basically saying we will need to look at increasing our defence spending above and beyond what we are. I mean, I think you only have to look at the Defence Strategic Review, the government's own words, that the world right now is facing its most challenging strategic environment since World War II. And so the government is effectively saying, maybe we're up for a chat about increasing defence spending, but clearly the Prime Minister and his ministers believe that what we're already spending is enough to meet that challenge. Now, the problem for the government is that it's not just Pete Hegseth who's calling for a big increase. We've seen Keir Starmer, UK, the third part of our AUKUS alliance. He has now set a target of hitting 3% of GDP of defence spending. We've got a number of former defence chiefs who've also said that we are not spending enough to meet the challenges that are really on our doorstep. And he was at the ASPI conference, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and when I was reading the report that the government took issue with, ASPI also believes that we need to massively increase defence spending. There was one line that has sort of gone under the radar, and it's from the ASPI chief, Justin Bassey, and he referred to the Chinese flotilla that recently circumnavigated Australia. Our Navy couldn't keep up because our supply ships were in dry dock, but he said this Chinese flotilla was rehearsing strikes on Australian cities, national infrastructure and joint military facilities.
Wow.
So it's a really big statement.
You wonder no one was staying at the time. You wonder if that's being floated to...
That's right.
Where's he getting that from? And
that's it. And so I think you kind of got to look at that, and it's like, well, we don't really have people sort of openly telling the Australian public what the challenges actually mean. And there you have it. Our greatest strategic threat in our region is carrying out exercises like this.
And it's not just the threat of a Chinese flotilla firing a missile from the sea. It's the way modern warfare is so rapidly evolving. Look at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. I had a fascinating chat for our podcast this week. I'll give it a plug here with Mick Ryan. You'd know him. He's the former Major General. Was more than 3 decades in the Australian Army. He's been spending a lot of time in Ukraine talking to the commanders there, looking at what they're doing and writing a lot about this. The use of unmanned systems is phenomenal. What Ukraine is doing, what the Russians are doing as well. And it does change the game in terms of how vulnerable our bases are going to be from this sort of thing. And here's what he reckons when it comes to defence spending.
One of the problems we have is that we haven't looked at different options. We haven't looked at the opportunity costs of things like the AUKUS submarines, which at 2% of GDP are not affordable if we want to have AUKUS submarines and an Australian Defence Force. At 2%, you get one or the other, not both.
One or the other, not both.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Jane said too, I think that rhetoric is exactly what made the Prime Minister so angry. And he had a big go at ASPI a week or so ago and accused them of being partisan. Now, Justin Bassey worked for the coalition in government. Anthony Albanese is zeroing in on that because that's a serious accusation. That's suggesting that our government has put our national security at risk in a very direct way. So I think that is a bit enlightening in terms of what made him so cross.
One thing I want to say, David, just picking up from your interview with James Paterson there, in a broader sense, it's great that the Liberal Party have rediscovered their DNA, as it were, and they're now the party of lower taxes again. But I think what we saw at the last election is that Australians, and this has been the case, I think, for a number of years, at least a decade, Australians want a European social program funded by an American tax system, and that doesn't work. And clearly from James Paterson there, we at least from in his case, are seeing a coalition that's still not ready to have a mature conversation about how do we pay for that.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because he was very clear that they're up for a tax reform debate in this term. But the government needs to bring it forward. But then also saying we're not up for increasing taxes anywhere. Can you have genuine tax reform without lifting any tax?
Well, the objective is to raise more money and run tax more effectively and efficiently. If the objective is to get more from taxation to spend on other things, how do you do it without raising tax?
Yeah, and there's plenty of experts.
It can't just be efficiency, David. There actually needs to be a grown-up conversation. Now, I had a bit of a go at Jim Chalmers during the week about this. Paterson's right. It is up to the government to lead the way, but they need to sit down as well, the coalition, and get serious about tax reform, because we are not on a sustainable trajectory in terms of the NDIS. We probably do need to. We probably will have our hand forced in terms of defence spending. So,
how do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? I mean, I know, look, the coalition deserve time to work out, how they're going to do all these things, but if you're committing to that scale of spending increase, where's it come from?
It's not a 2% efficiency dividend, right? It needs to be a bit more substantial than that.
Yeah, so on the super tax debate, the very current debate that, it's been going for a couple of years.
3 years.
Couple of years now. But it's flared since the election because clearly the government has the chance now to pass it with the Greens. The coalition, you heard it there from James Paterson, said no deal, we're not engaging in this at all. And James, you wrote about this during the week. Should both the major parties be involved in trying to find a solution here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great reasons for the economic success of Australia in the 80s, the opening up of markets, all of that was because Paul Keating and Bob Hawke had a guy called John Howard, who was then the deputy leader of the opposition, who was committed to reform. And it probably kept the opposition, the then coalition, in the opposition or on the opposition benches for a bit longer than they would have liked. But it actually set Australia up for decades of prosperity. What we need now is some kind of similar moment or agreement, and it's not going to be easy to get to. Both sides need to give a bit of ground, and I don't know exactly what it looks like. Is it super reform in exchange for something else? Is it a winding back of capital gains discount in exchange for? I don't know, but there needs to be a grown-up conversation, and I'm hopeful that we can have that this term.
I think it's important to note that the reason it's a big issue now is not because the government's pushing it. The government isn't in any particular hurry for this. It's the opposition that's made it a big issue because they didn't bang on about it during the election campaign, and it's giving them something to unify behind and yell at the government over. So they are the ones that are making an issue of it, which will create some discomfort for the government, but that's why it's now an issue. They're arguing that it's unfair and unjust.
Yeah.
What will be interesting is to see whether the government, when it does come to the Senate, is happy to do its first deal with, this won't be the first legislation that goes in, but to do a deal with the Greens, or whether on this or other things it's looking to send the Greens a bit of a message and say, you're not the only ones in the Parliament we can do a deal with. Maybe we will find a way to do a deal with the coalition.
I think on this one, though, and have a listen to Jim Chalmers on this, it seems pretty clear to me that he's saying, fine.
Doesn't want to move.
I'll go with the Greens if they're willing to pass it as it is. Here he was.
My preference and my intention is to legislate the package that we proposed more than 2 years ago. Pointing out that we don't have the numbers on our own in the Senate is just a reflection of the reality. I'll have a discussion with the crossbench with the Greens at some point between now and when the Parliament returns.
Yeah, so look, just to remind people, this is about hiking the tax on balances, super balances of more than $3 million, and that would include taxing unrealised gains, which is the big concern for the coalition and plenty of others as well. The Greens don't seem to have a problem with that. They want the government to go even harder and hike the tax above $2 million, but are they really going to vote against something like this?
Well, I think that the interesting thing about the Greens is Nick McKim put out a statement this week and he basically made the government's argument for them, where he said that, superannuation is about providing a dignified retirement for working people, not a vehicle for wealth accumulation. And so that's basically at the heart of the government's argument here. So if they manage to curb these tax breaks, it'll save the budget $2 billion a year, $2 billion that the government currently needs to be spending in other areas. And they've made the point, it's kind of an equity argument, that at the moment these general super tax concessions are costing the budget $45 billion a year, and 60% of that goes to the 20% of income earners. So it's about sort of redistribution. When it comes to the Greens, they want the threshold to be lowered. It's unclear if the government's open to sort of indexing the $3 million threshold. That's at the heart of that's the more contentious element as well. But it doesn't seem like the government sort of has an appetite to compromise.
It's hard to see the Greens sitting on the side of the chamber and voting no against a tax increase on big superannuation accounts. But that brings us to the Greens. It's been quite a week. Well, it's been quite a few weeks, James, for the Greens. Dorinda Cox defecting from the Greens to the Labor Party. You don't often see people joining the government of the day when they change parties. Why? Why did she make the move?
Look, I think there's a couple of things at play here. Dorinda, was very much sort of in the moderate corner or faction or grouping, if you like, of the Greens. And I think in the last term of Parliament, the Greens had a party room that rewarded the most strident, the noisiest voices. And I think she felt a little bit on the outer. There have been a number of allegations made against Senator Cox that I and a lot of other reporters have sort of covered over the last 8
These are the bullying
months.
complaints.
Exactly. Now, Senator Cox has denied the allegations, but apologised if anyone's, was upset or their feelings were hurt or whatever it might be. There's more to come on that front. And then the kind of broader picture is she was almost certainly not going to win the #1 spot on the Greens ticket for the next election in 2028, which means her political career is over. With Labor, she'll probably get the 3rd spot. It's been winnable in the last couple of elections. It may not be next time. We don't know where things will be up to in WA for Labor then, but at least she'll have a chance, right? And so there's also a thing I think to keep in mind, which is that Dorinda was a member of the Labor Party before she was in the Greens. That bigger party with a bigger hierarchy and structures may actually suit her a hell of a lot better than the Greens have.
Although she's been very critical of Labor positions on issues like the North West Shelf gas extension. And I want to show you here the before and after when she's in the Greens and then when she's in the Labor Party.
We are not going to allow a carbon bomb to be let off here at the North West Shelf.
I think that the provisional approval done by Minister Watt, I believe, is still in train, and it wouldn't be suitable for me to have public commentary during that stage.
Yeah, so, Karen, there are clearly some risks in Labor taking on Dorinda Cox, but are they more about the policy shifts or what James just said, there's more to come on the bullying stuff?
Well, there are some risks, and there's also whether there'll be a warm embrace from her fellow caucus members who've heard her bagging out Labor for a long time. So there's that concern. But I think for Anthony Albanese, he plays the long game. So he's looking ahead. And what will happen now is she's got the benefit of incumbency in getting that 3rd spot and fighting for that spot in Western Australia. They won 3 spots at the 2022 election. They didn't this time. They lost to One Nation. He's looking ahead. One Nation will be seeking to build on their gains at this election and do what the Greens have done. That leapfrogging arrangement with the Senate means that as a small party you can build, because you're doing 3-year rotations. She can build next time, and then she becomes a significant force, Pauline Hanson and One Nation, in the Senate. So he's trying to maximise his chances to have a buffer against that.
Yeah, and the other thing too, if Dorinda Cox had quit the Greens to sit on the crossbench, life would have been more difficult for the government because they would have then needed the Greens plus one of the crossbenchers to pass anything. Now, Dorinda Cox comes into their ranks and they still can pass anything just with the Greens, should they need to. Some in the Greens think that Dorinda Cox, having just discovered that her values more align with Labor, should have quit before the election and run as a Labor candidate, or certainly should not be continuing to hold that Green seat as they see it in the Parliament.
It's not fair to the voters and indeed any of the parties involved that if somebody is elected as one party and then jumps ship later on, I do think the honourable thing is to resign from the Parliament.
Well, that's not going to happen. Didn't happen with Fatima Payman.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So when Fatima Payman famously moved to the crossbench under Labor, her own colleagues were saying, you must now quit and move to the crossbench. Suddenly, when it's an MP coming or senator coming to Labor's side, that same argument's not being made from Labor.
But it's bizarre that. Who would have thought?
Okay, whatever.
But for the Greens, this is another setback for them, and James touched on it earlier, Jane, this sort of tension within the ranks about what direction they want to go in.
Absolutely. I mean, The Greens lost 3 of their 4 lower house seats at the election. They lost their leader, one of their most vocal opponents of much of the Albanese government's agenda, Max Chandler-Mather, was turfed from Parliament. And so while the Greens say that nationally their votes kind of held, it certainly has in the Senate, they went backwards at this election, and now Larissa Waters, the new leader, is dealing with a defection too. So she is certainly trying to take a more cooperative approach, picking fights where they have to, but ultimately, going with the government's agenda and making sort of some amendments. So we'll see. I guess the super tax will be the first real test of this in the new parliament, but certainly it has.
And then the environment laws will
be
the bigger one to come in this term as well.
The other thing to say, David, is the Greens often make a virtue or make a point of saying we're not like the old parties, we're different, we do politics differently. Everything that's happened to them in the last 8 or 9 months with, the allegations against Cox, going backwards at the election, the defection, it looks just like the old parties.
And just give us quickly an insight into that sort of factional divide, if we can call it that, within the Greens.
Without wanting to be disrespectful, within the Greens there's 2 groupings, the sort of hardcore Greenies, if you like, and I don't mean that derogatorily, but, the Bob Brown, Christine Milne, Sarah Hanson... Climate-focused people, and then you've got the watermelon grouping, which what some people perhaps unkindly call them, which is green on the outside, red on the inside. That's sort of Maureen Faruqi, I think David Shoebridge to some extent. It's probably the larger grouping of Greens in the party room now. It's hard to say that definitively. And that's where the tension lies. Are we growing a bigger social movement or are we focused on the environment?
Very interesting. All right, our panel, Jane Norman, James Massola, Karen Middleton, back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for the New Daily. I'm talking pictures this morning with journalist, cartoonist and author Eleri Harris, and a very warm welcome. You've published a book, A Lure of One's Own, which is about the serious lack of female toilets in this building.
Yeah, even though this building opened 25 years after women got the right to vote and stand for election, there were no toilets for women in the working part of the building.
Right, so parliamentarian toilets. Isn't it lovely to see the Liberal Party's moved on completely? Because, Alan Stockdale suggested that perhaps it was the men that needed to be looked after, not assertive women.
Progress. It's happening very quickly in Australia.
Lovely Cathy Wilcox cartoon. So I said, you ladies don't need special quotas. You're assertive enough as it is. Just joking, of course.
I really enjoyed Bridget McKenzie's comment saying that they should go back to the Melbourne Club and sit down with a whiskey. And I feel like this is what Cathy's doing here in this cartoon. And there's like the dinosaur skeleton.
With new US tariffs on steel and aluminium, the US administration is really testing our mettle. Mark Knight's done a lovely Man of Steel tariffs, tipping some molten lead onto Anthony Albanese here.
Yeah, all you can do is imagine what the tariff feels like, and I guess that's what you have here. It's like molten metal.
Dean Alston from the West Australian seems to think that this is going to be a Top Gun type of affair with never mind Iran. I want to test these bunker busters on our friends first.
I think it feels like he's Roger Ramjet here. It's like, great, here, we're going to treat our friends with the utmost respect and kindness.
Yeah, Brett Lethbridge has got pinball diplomacy with US President bouncing around between 125 and 50% tariffs.
Yeah, going between the appeal and the courts. And that's what I think about the feeling. It feels like a boom, 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 boom.
It wasn't just tariffs we were having to deal with this week. Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary, suggesting we need to spend more on defence.
More on defence. Yeah. That's the top of the pops. That's,
Cathy Wilcox.
You folks should spend up on defence. Can't you see what a threat China is to world peace?
Yeah.
And then you've got, obviously, Trump sitting there with all of these things that the US are doing. That's not a threat to world peace.
AUKUS, what AUKUS? I love that little balloon there that's floating. Quit the World Health Organisation. David Rowe, in a way that only David Rowe can do, has got Richard Marles in bed after the meeting, and here's Party Sauce Pete.
The hangover from that is going to be an even worse Rowe cartoon.
Miles in Wonderland. If only China would show the same kind of regional transparency. Albo, you there? I think I'd hang up on him too.
Yeah.
Johanna seems to feel like we're riding on the back of MAGA with NDIS, DEI and net zero. He's got a very buffed up Pete Hegseth here. No worries, Pete. Australia's got your back.
A bit creepy.
It's very creepy. Dorinda Cox had the Greens seeing red as she switched parties. It's been quite an eventful post-election period, hasn't it?
Yeah, high drama, I would say.
Yeah.
Even like a week ago, she was railing against the gas stuff, and now here we are.
I did love this David Pope, the wedding gift registry. It's just such a lovely take on...
it's beautiful.
It's Anthony Albanese in bed here with Jodie fast asleep. There's a toaster from Susan.
A kettle from Little Proud.
Oh, and a senator from the Greens voters in WA.
Should we have added a carbon offset option on this page?
Gone with the windbag, David Rowe.
But where shall I go? What shall I do? Golf aside.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a Tesla. Bromance has turned into a no-mance, hasn't it?
I know. Trump called Elon crazy, and Elon saying that, Trump might have had something to do with Epstein.
Yeah, I know. It is spectacular. David Pope, Dozilla versus King Don. Destroy any remaining trust in government by replacing every department with an AI chatbot.
No, destroy any residual trust in government by looting the budget for tax cuts for the rich. I really love the childlikeness of it. They look like big toddlers in animal suits, destroying all of the Lego underfoot.
Yeah, need a playpen around them. It's been a great pleasure, Eleri, coming to the Senate chamber of the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House, and I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, Captain Speers.
Thank you, Eleri. Thank you, Mike, very much for that. Let's get some final observations. Jane.
Well, Spearsy, another mess for Susan Lee to have to clean up very soon is with her in her own division of the New South Wales Liberal Party. You might remember last year Peter Dutton was forced to put the division into administration, and he appointed elders Alan Stockdale and Richard Alston from Victoria to clean up the mess after the party famously failed to submit paperwork for the local government elections. Well, their term is due to expire on the 30th of June, and there is white-hot anger within sections of the Liberal Party for them to just go. They hate this whole administration. They want them to go back to Victoria, which is facing its own issues there. The question is what they've spent 9 months doing. They're apparently rewriting the rules, but nothing's sort of been put forward, and I'm told they only started consultation with some senior Liberals last week. This week, of course, Alan Stockdale has really kind of cemented views.
You've got to tell us what he said.
He said
I'm not sure this is going to help his chances of
to the Liberal
staying
Women's
on.
Council that there were sufficiently assertive women within the Liberal Party, and that maybe the men might need to be protected from them. And so in one fell swoop, saying to an audience of Liberal women, I think that he's cemented views in some parts of the party. And so the moderates and centre-right want them gone, and now it's up to Susan Lee basically to figure out whether to extend their tenure and what to do with the division after June 30.
Yeah, I think he suggested that he was saying that in jest or something and apologised, but boy, oh boy.
Tone deaf, perhaps.
Wow. James.
About 9 months ago, David, on this couch, I said to you there was some way to run with the Dorinda Cox story. I will not lie, I did not have joining the Labor Party on my dance card.
Wow.
But it's not done yet, and an ABC story alluded to that fact this week. Auntie Esther Montgomery, an Indigenous elder over in WA, flagged there is a possibility that some of the people who have levelled these quite serious allegations against Dorinda Cox of bullying and what have you, I'll say it again, she's denied the bad behaviour, that they may move forward with a legal case. It's TBC, but, watch this space.
Watch this space. All right, Karen.
Just mention something I wrote about this weekend, and I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. It's a High Court case. You remember a couple of years ago, the government repossessed land set aside for a new Russian embassy, and it passed emergency legislation to do that. Well, the Russians are taking them to the High Court, arguing that it's unconstitutional and has no head of power, and it wants either the land back or compensation. Now, one of the key issues here is the government is suggesting they're a national security risk. They haven't provided either to the court or the parliament the basis for that concern. It's information from ASIO, they have said that, and they've said to the court, you can infer that it's really, really serious by the fact that, well, it's ASIO, and the government made a new law in response. So this is going to be a fascinating case because the government did lose a High Court case a couple of years ago over immigration detention that caused it a huge political headache. It's not going to be a great look if it ends up having to pay compensation to Russia over this. So we don't have a hearing date yet, but I reckon it's going to be a very interesting one to watch. And the Russians have hired Brett Walker, SC, the highest profile barrister, constitutional barrister in the country, to make their case.
That is going to be a fascinating test case.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, Richard Marles has been under a fair bit of pressure lately. There's the growing chorus calling for more defence spending. He was recently labelled a factional assassin, but at least the Defence Minister finds time to stop and take in a moment of beauty. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
We're in a fish tank.
Oh.
Do something.
Do you need us to help you with that?
No.
That's amazing, very nice.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.